I think it's on. I think it's on. It is. I'd like to welcome all the students back from spring break. I hope you had a good spring break. And also would like to welcome all of our visitors. We have several visitors here today. It's always very exciting for us to have people from the community, and I know this event means a great deal to them, and it does to us as well. We used to be known as the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, and it became very clear after I became the director that we needed to change that name. That although the Holocaust is the prototypical genocide, there were many genocides that happened before, and unfortunately genocides that happened afterwards. I was most fortunate to meet someone, and that someone is Christine Davidian, who is the president of the Armenians of the North Bay. And we began talking about the possibility of having a lecture every year that would highlight the Armenian genocide and what went on before the Holocaust. And in fact, we Holocaust scholars know that one of the things that Adolf Hitler said when asked about his intentions of eliminating Jews, he said, well, who remembers the Armenians? And we have taken that as our charge, and that is that we will remember what happened to the Armenian community every year in the spring, and we're doing it again today. We are most fortunate today to have with us an eminent historian by the name of Robert Hewsen, and his topic for today is Genocide Denial, Evolution of a Process. Dr. Hewsen has his PhD in Russian history from Georgetown University. He also has a BA in history and has studied as a postdoctoral fellow in classical Armenian. He's one of a distinguished group of Armenian scholars. He worked for 30 years, taught for 30 years at Rowan University. He's had visiting professorships at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the University of California at Los Angeles, California State University in Fresno, the University of Chicago, and Columbia University, as well as the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Michigan. His premier work is Armenia, Historical Atlas, and this is one of the maps that is in that book. He was kind enough to send us a copy so that we could have it for you so that you could follow along visually. It is my great pleasure to present to you Dr. Robert Hewsen. Please welcome.
Thank you very kindly. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I have a certain remote connection with Sonoma State University. My former university, where I taught for 30 years, Rowan, is now has your former president as its president, Dr. Farish, Dr. Donald Farish, is president of Rowan now, and he always spoke very well of Sonoma and his long experiences here. It's a pleasure to be here. As I said, I'd like to thank Mrs. Christine Davidian for inviting me to participate in this series, and also Dr. Myrna Goodman, Director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide, for her role in making it possible for me to be with you today. The subject of my talk, of course, concerns Armenia. and that's an ancient country of the Middle East, for those of you who are not familiar with it. It was a large country which lost its independence in the 11th century and then became divided between the Turks and the Persians in the 1500s. The Ottoman Empire, as the Turkish Empire was called, acquired the bulk of the country, and the Persians acquired the east. And on this map you can see Armenia located there in the northwest quadrant of the Middle East, at the eastern end of the Anatolian Peninsula, and you see these red lines which indicate the various invaders of Armenia, because as you can see from the map, I think very graphically, it was a crossroads of merchants, traders, and of course invading armies. So Armenia's had a very tragic history, and eventually the country was submerged, divided, as I said, between Ottoman Turkey and the Persians. The Russians acquired Persian Armenia, the smallest part of the country, in 1828. And Armenia remained under Russian rule until 1918, when it became independent briefly for 2 years as a republic. And then it was re-annexed by Russia and became part of the Soviet Union until 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Armenia became independent once again. So it's been independent twice in the past 1,000 years. The Turkish section of the country, the largest part, was completely denuded of its Armenian population during and just after the First World War, the period 1915 to 1923. I'm going to be speaking specifically about the Armenian genocide and the evolution of the denial of the Armenian genocide. It's a controversial subject that's been hotly debated and made extremely current by the insistence of the European Union that the government of the modern Turkish Republic confess to the wicked deeds of the old Ottoman Empire that preceded it, before being considered as a member of this somewhat exclusive club. What they're being asked to admit is that in the years 1915 to 23, the Turkish government attempted to exterminate its Armenian population, a procedure termed by Armenians the Armenian Genocide. Now, Turkey wants to get into the European Union very badly, and there are important members of the European Union that would rather not have Turkey in. So the European Union is requiring that Turkey admit to the genocide, and I think some people hope they won't, in order they would have a legitimate reason to keep them out. The Turks, aided by a few non-Turkish boosters in the West, deny that anything that can be called a genocide actually took place in Anatolia during or after World War I. And the evolution of this process of denial is what I want to survey with you today. For many decades after the First World War, the genocide of the Armenian population of Anatolia was a recognized historical fact in the Western world. Many books and an infinite number of articles were written about the subject. Memoirs were written, eyewitness accounts published, and government documents made available. Gradually, however, over the years, the story faded from popular memory. The Armenians had always wanted a republic of their own, and with the establishment of Soviet Armenia, they were thought to have acquired it. The Treaty of Lausanne ended the war between the Allies in World War I and the Ottoman Empire, and there were no more starving Armenians to take pity on. The survivors, scattered, were traumatized, paralyzed, busy getting settled in their new lives, and the subject simply faded from the attention of the world. Then there occurred two events that changed all of this, gradually at first, and then with increased rapidity. The first was the 1965 commemoration by Armenians of the 50th anniversary of the events of 1915, a commemoration taking place both in the United States and abroad, and even in Armenia itself, until 1991, a constituent republic within the Soviet Union. The Soviet government did not want the Armenians to commemorate the genocide, but there was so much pressure in Armenia, including the people out in the streets demanding recognition of the 50th anniversary, that the Moscow government decided to relent. And it was not like the Moscow government in those days, the 1960s, to give way on anything. But they figured, okay, let them have their parade and their demonstration, let them build their monument and get it over with. The second event that took place was the beginning in 1973 of a series of terrorist attacks whereby Armenian radicals and certain underground Armenian organizations began a systematic policy of assassinating Turkish diplomats in a desperate attempt to get the world to recognize what had transpired in Anatolia during and after the First World War. They achieved nothing permanent, but it created a lot of bad publicity for Turkey. The result of this bad publicity led the Turkish government to undertake a serious rebuttal to Armenian charges. Now you might ask why. Why not simply ignore what the Armenians were doing and saying? The perpetrators of the assassinations became discredited, even among Armenians, and their actions soon came to an end. Why was there denial? Well, I remember attending a meeting in Connecticut back in 1983 that had to do with the Armenian genocide. And a middle-aged Armenian-American lady got up and she said, if only the Turks would admit it, if only they would apologize for it, then we could have closure and we could put it to rest. And I got up and I spoke and I said, you're misinformed, madam. I said, it isn't closure that the Armenians want. The Armenians want reparations for what happened. That's why they're asking the Turks to admit it, because they want reparations. Well, the Turks know this. They're not fools. They're anything but fools. The Turks know this. And they have no money. When I visited Turkey in 1998, you got 250,000 lira to the dollar. When I went back a year later, you got 750,000 lira to the dollar. Turkish money was then worthless, and the Armenians knew this, and of course, they're not after Turkish money. What they want is land. They want their land back. They want a large chunk, if not all, of Turkish Armenia to be given to the Armenian Republic. Well, that area is inhabited today by at least 12 million Kurds. So the question comes up, well, if you get that land back, what are you going to do with the Kurds? And when I pose this to Armenian activists, what are you going to do about the Kurds? They sort of squirm and they say, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Well, that's the point. The Turkish government has no intention of waiting until that bridge is even neared. By denying the fact of the genocide, the Turks have halted all discussion right at that point. You can't talk about reparations for acts whose very perpetration is still in dispute. So that is the major reason for the genocide. Once they admit there was a genocide, the Turks have to talk about reparations. They have no intention of talking about reparations. To Americans living in a country where, according to our legal system, the accused are considered innocent until proven guilty, this all seems quite reasonable. You know, if there was a genocide, well, Armenians have to prove it, you see. And Armenians are put in this terrible situation where, as somebody pointed out just before my talk, every year in April when the genocide began, the Armenians have to begin by proving that there was a genocide when they should be talking about something much more important, like acquiring some kind of a restitution for that genocide. In this way, the denial of the Armenian genocide gradually became more advanced and to a great extent more successful than the parallel denial of the Jewish Holocaust. The Jewish Holocaust has the advantage of being more recent. The Jews are much more numerous, and they're better known as a people. They have many more survivors to tell their stories. Above all, Germany has admitted its crimes against the Jewish people. The result, no one outside of, say, the Middle East takes the Holocaust deniers seriously. The deniers of the Jewish Holocaust have no government to support them. They've been largely identified as anti-Semites, many of them attached to anti-Semitic or at least pro-Palestinian organizations. None of the Holocaust deniers are remotely respectable, and few would be tolerated on any American campus for a single semester. The deniers of the Armenian genocide have had better luck. Outside of a few centers in this country, New York, New Jersey, California, Armenians are rare in this country. Most people know virtually nothing about the events that took place in Armenia during World War I. So much so that the word alleged is often applied to the genocide in the American press, and a few deniers have even managed to occupy positions in certain academic institutions. I'm going to be talking very briefly about the major figures so you get an idea of the people that form the denial community. The first one, the most important one, is Dr. Stanford Shaw, who recently died. He was a tenured professor at UCLA for decades, and in 1992 retired with honors. A second is Heath Lowry, holder of a chair of Turkish studies at Princeton University, despite serious questions about his academic credentials and his reputed association with the Turkish secret police. And the third is Dr. Justin McCarthy, the most respectable of the three, who is a tenured professor at the University of Louisville, Kentucky. There's no point in saying that these individuals are pro-Turkish or Turkophile. There's nothing unexpected about that. Many of the most active scholars who accept the reality of the genocide are either Armenian or pro-Armenian and make no bones about it. There's no point saying that Heath Lowry was formerly director of the Institute for Turkish Studies, a Turkish government-financed operation serving Turkish interests. He was. But most Armenian chairs have been funded by Armenian organizations and by individuals, obviously, to serve Armenian interests. There's no point in saying that Heath Lowry and Justin McCarthy were students of Stanford Shaw. Many practicing Armenists have been students of Richard Hovhannissian, the major champion of the Armenian genocide. So what? Were Shaw and Lowry married to Turkish women? I know two major non-Armenian Armenists who have Armenian wives. I mean, these are accusations thrown at these people that I think are a waste of time. The problem is not who they studied under or who they're married to. The problem begins with their claim to be scholars, but who are willing to write books and articles containing either deliberate falsehoods or omitting contrary data that does not support their published views, and are thus seriously misleading. To see the mud slung from both sides, the Turks and the Armenians, you need only consult the internet. You have only to look up the people I've named, the concerned individuals, and you'll find both sides of the story, sometimes presented in an academic and disinterested manner, and frequently as barefaced polemic. On the Armenian side, Dr. Richard G. Hovhannissian, professor of history at UCLA, and with Vahakam Dadrian, one of the two foremost authorities in the world on the Armenian genocide, has taken the lead in confronting genocide denial, beginning at the annual convention of the Middle East Studies Association in New York City in 1977. There he launched the first public critique of Stanford Shaw's two-volume History of the Ottoman Empire, in which Shaw took the position that there had never been a pre-planned genocide, that what happened to the Armenians was largely their own fault, and that nothing that occurred was part of an advanced plan of the Turks to exterminate the Armenian people. The other great defender of the genocide, Dr. Hakan Dadrian, is an especially prolific author. Having mastered many languages, including modern and Ottoman Turkish, he has researched archives in many different countries, as few have done before him. While Dadrian's specialization is genocide in general, most of his study concerns the Armenian genocide, even though he has publications regarding such other cases as the Jewish Holocaust and the destruction of the American Indians. Much of my own view of the genocide debate has been colored by my readings in the works of Richard Hovhannissian, but I've also read what Shaw and McCarthy have had to say as well, and also some of the materials published in English in Istanbul and Ankara. A scholar of great erudition and enormous energy, Hovhannissian cites 4 stages in denial as the Turkish response to accusations of genocide have moved from absolute negation, denial, to rationalization, relativism, and trivialization. I accept all of Richard Hovhannissian's categories, but I see 3 other phases as well. I'd like to take the categories of Hovhannissian and those that I have added and examine them one by one. Phase 1 I call obliteration. Obliteration or erasure. By this I mean the conscious and deliberate attempt to remove the Armenian presence in Turkish Armenia from the historical record. It is in effect the final stage of the genocide, and it is still in progress. Genocide is the physical annihilation of a given ethnic entity, the murder of a people, what the Germans call Völkermord. Obliteration is the removal of the evidence of their past presence in the areas within which they once lived. There are 2 aspects to this ethnic obliteration. The first is the elimination of pre-Turkish place names, not only on the Armenian plateau, but anywhere in Anatolia where they might be found. This was not limited to Armenian place names, but included those that were of Greek origin as well. The second aspect is the wanton destruction of architectural remains that attest to the previous presence of non-Turkish elements upon the same plateau. The elimination of non-Turkish place names is not a serious matter. Names can always be changed back, as witness St. Petersburg, which became Petrograd during the First World War, Leningrad after the First World War, and now it's St. Petersburg again. Much more serious is the destruction of Armenian and Greek buildings, ranging from humble village churches to major architectural monuments. On the other hand, we have seen the recent restoration of the Church of the Holy Cross on the island of Akdamar in Lake Van, completed last summer and celebrated in Turkey by a commemorative ceremony this past month, March 17th. This was done not because the Turks relented on the destruction of Armenian monuments, but because they tried to get tourists out to that part of Turkey. And this is one of the few things worth going out there to see, you know. So. Phase 2 is denial properly called. The idea that no genocide ever took place. Stanford Shaw, of course, was the arch-denier, which leads me to the Stanford Shaw Affair. His 2-volume work, History of the Ottoman Empire and Modern Turkey, written with the collaboration of his Turkish wife, Errol Shaw, created a great stir when it first appeared in 1977. The response to this book passed through 3 stages. The first was the academic reaction. The book was generally received by American reviewers, but many Turkologists criticized the book for its numerous errors of historical fact. Armenian scholars criticized it because of its bias. I'll give you an example of what we mean by bias. In the book, Stanford Shaw mentions the seizure by Armenians of the Ottoman Bank in Constantinople in 1896. But in doing so, he makes no mention of the 3 years of massacre in Armenia that had taken place previously to this seizure of the Ottoman Bank. It makes no mention of why. What the impression you get is that the wicked Armenians just grabbed this bank and did this illegally. The second response to Shaw's work was the Armenian student reaction at UCLA, where there was a great uproar. There were demonstrations on campus, picketing of Shaw's classes, trashing of his office. They broke into his office and vandalized it, threats and harassment, culminating in the bombing of his home. Shaw had to take a year's leave of absence while things cooled down. Finally, the reaction of scholars knowledgeable in both sides of the story formed the third response. Scholars who were able to approach the book with facts, figures, and above all with a knowledge of Turkish, both Ottoman and modern. The biggest mistake, of course, was the personal attack on Stanford Shaw. Nothing is more sacred to academicians in the Western world than freedom of expression and the doctrine that the only way to fight an idea is to argue against it with better ideas, not through suppression. In the West, we normally attack ideas, not personalities. What was done to Stanford Shaw, of course, backfired by generating enormous sympathy for him and ultimately derailing attempts by serious academics, some of them in his own department at UCLA, to call him to task before the academic world. My first reaction was to go out and read the book, which many of Shaw's Armenian critics have not bothered to do, after which I wrote a polite but firm letter to Dr. Shaw questioning his methodology. His response, equally courteous, was to offer to alter his views if, like himself, I could find support for my interpretations in the Ottoman archives. Not knowing Turkish, I, of course, was unable to do so. Professor Shaw had, therefore, deftly and, as I said, courteously shut me up. Unfortunately for Dr. Shaw, however, other people less ignorant of Turkish than I had been in the Ottoman archives for themselves, so much so that they were able to demonstrate that despite his letter to me, Dr. Shaw did not appear to have been in the Ottoman archives to any degree, perhaps not even at all. On the contrary, he had found a much simpler way of composing his text. For this, we must turn to the work of Speros Vrionis, at that time a colleague of Stanford Shaw in the history department at UCLA. A specialist in Byzantine, Seljuk, and early Ottoman studies, fully trained in the reading of Ottoman and modern Turkish, and recognizing certain passages in Shaw's book as material that he had read elsewhere for himself, Vrionis discovered, to his dismay, that a full 40% of Shaw's book was plagiarized from the work of a Turkish historian. He then found that another 40% had been plagiarized from the work of another Turkish historian. He then found that 10% of the book had been lifted from a Turkish encyclopedia. Professor Vrionis declined to expend his time pursuing the question of how much of the remaining 10% of the book might have been plagiarized as well. With 90% demonstrably plagiarized, what would it matter where he got the rest of the book? Armed with his findings, Vrionis, and by the way, I heard this story directly from Vrionis himself. Armed with his findings, Vrionis went to the administration at UCLA and demonstrated what I have just described. In a word, the two-volume opus of Stanford Shaw, supposedly based on fresh research in the Ottoman archives, a work that had made his reputation as a scholar, was in fact an almost total fraud. All of this Vrionis demonstrated in a book that he wrote describing his analysis of Shaw's two volumes. Again, to his dismay, Professor Vrionis discovered that the administration at UCLA, apparently fearing bad publicity and a long, costly, and embarrassing litigation, declined to take any action regarding Dr. Shaw's activities, least of all to remove him from his position. All right, they said to Briones, in effect, you've made your point, let it go, enough's enough. Briones had been offered a position at NYU. He told the administration, either Shaw goes or I go. Believe it or not, they let Briones go. And he went to NYU. The story does not end here. Professor Shaw was eventually named Distinguished Professor at UCLA, and upon his retirement in 1992 was tendered a banquet. He died last fall. This brings us to the Heath Lowry affair. Heath Lowry is a professor at Princeton University whose recent appointment to a chair of Turkish studies funded by the Turkish government in 1995 prompted a firestorm of protest. Lowry was denounced as a long-time lobbyist for the Turks. He was denounced for taking pictures. He was seen taking pictures of picketers outside of the Turkish embassy. He was the head of an endowed Turkish institution, the Turkish Institute for Turkish Studies in Washington, D.C., supposedly an independent operation. His career was noticeably short on scholarly accomplishments. He'd never held a full-time teaching position at an American university and had never written a scholarly book published by a mainstream trade or university press. Finally, the terms of the chair, the terms of the endowment of this chair by the Turkish government, carried a requirement that the appointee must have conducted research in the Turkish archives. But since Turkey controls access to its archives and has been known to ban scholars that it considers unfriendly, the Turkish government would be allowed to manipulate the pool of applicants. Princeton accepted these terms. Now, the Turks then offered to set up a chair at UCLA, but UCLA, apparently fearful of more problems, declined the offer. The offer was made to Harvard. The Turkish government offered money for a chair at Harvard University. Harvard accepted with the proviso that this term, that the holder of the chair be able to conduct research in Turkish archives be removed. The response to Dr. Lowry's appointment was predictable. Over 100 prominent scholars and writers signed a petition decrying what they called scholarly corruption. There were a flurry of embarrassing articles in the journals of higher education, especially in the prestigious Chronicle of Higher Education, where the whole affair was covered closely. I wrote my own letter to Princeton University, since I taught about an hour and a quarter away from it, and I wrote and offered my own polite protest, pointing out that Dr. Lowry had been the director of the Institute for Turkish Studies, which was by no means an independent operation. They never replied. And the chair went through, and Professor Lowry sits there today. I think the attitude at Princeton was, I think it was a mistake, but the attitude at Princeton was, no one's going to tell Princeton who it's going to appoint to a particular position. I remember, I'm going to take a little moment to tell you this anecdote. I remember when they were looking for a holder of the first Armenian chair at Harvard University, and they were considering different people, and some of whom were not Armenians. And the people who'd organized that chair went to Harvard and said, we think an Armenian ought to hold that chair. Well, you don't talk like that to Harvard. And Harvard picked the man they wanted, and he wasn't an Armenian. And the person who told me that was one of the people who was competing for the job. And when they told him that we're speaking to Harvard University, that the position should be held by an Armenian, he said, I knew right then and there I wasn't going to get the job. And that brings us very briefly to the Bernard Lewis affair. Bernard Lewis was an extremely respected historian. I used his books when I was in college. He's still alive, so he's up there, believe me. but he's a very respected scholar. But in an interview with the French journal Le Monde in 1993, he denied that what happened in 1915 in Turkey was a genocide. Well, that's illegal in France. And Bernard Lewis was brought to trial for it, but he was acquitted. Phase 3 of genocide denial is trivialization. Trivialization is a process of taking something important and arguing that it is, in the end, no great matter at all. This takes two forms. This trivialization takes two forms. First, the denigration of the sources. If you're going to say there's a genocide, you have to have sources to prove it. And the genocide deniers denigrate the sources. The Armenian sources, how can we believe the Armenians, who have such a stake in discrediting the Turks? This is what they say. The British, French, and Russian sources, they were at war with Ottoman Turkey. We're talking here of wartime propaganda. The German and Austrian sources, weren't they allies of Ottoman Turkey? Yes, they were, but after all, they were both Christian states and had a Christian bias in favor of the Armenians. What about the missionaries, American, German, Danish? They too were pro-Armenian and anti-Muslim. What about the resident consuls, representatives of the foreign ambassadors in Constantinople, the representatives in the provinces? There was an Italian ambassador at Trabzon. There was a Persian ambassador at consul at Van. Well, these were all dismissed. The Italian consul, he was a Christian. He was prejudiced against the Turks. The Persians, well, they're Shiites, and they hate the Turks because the Turks are Sunnis. What about the Greek population? The Greek evidence. There were more Greeks in Anatolia than Armenians, and they were everywhere where the Armenians were deported. There were Greeks who lived in terror of being next on the list. What about their evidence? Well, they were Christians, you see, and it's more anti-Turkish propaganda. What about the Arab sources? Well, the Arabs were in open rebellion against the Turks. More wartime propaganda. What about the Turkish sources? After World War I, there were trials of Turkish officials who were partly responsible for the genocide, and the genocide was openly admitted at the time. Well, that evidence was taken under duress, we're told, and you can't pay any attention to that. What about the photographs of the dead? Well, who knows who those dead people were? They could have been Turks killed by the Armenians. Well, who can we believe? With all this massive evidence discredited, who can we believe? No problem. Why, we have the testimony of the accused. Only the Turks are telling the truth. Only the accused have no reason to hide the facts. The only problem with this, of course, is that the Turks are alone in their version of what happened. All of the reports, local and foreign, Armenian, American, British, French, Russian, German, Austrian, Italian, Danish, Greek, Arab, Persian, agree with one another. Even a Venezuelan soldier of fortune fighting with the Turks corroborates the Armenian claim that Armenians were massacred at government order. The second aspect of trivialization is the reduction of the number of victims. The master at this is Justin McCarthy. He admits that the Turkish census takers undercounted the Armenians in Turkey, and he freely raises the figures to account for this. But he then asserts that the Turks also undercounted the Turkish population, so that their figures have to be raised as well. Now, that's Justin McCarthy's approach. A major contention of genocide deniers has been to reject Armenian figures for the number of victims of the genocide. And here they have a strong point. In the absence of any tally of the number of Armenians actually killed or deported, the only way of determining the number of victims is to subtract the survivors from the number who were living in the affected areas. And for this reason, a great deal of research and pseudo-research has been expended on this subject. And I must say that some of the figures that have been brought forward are unacceptable. How many Armenians were victimized in the genocide? I've heard 600,000, 1 million, 1,500,000, 2 million, 2,500,000, and once I heard 3 million. And this was not a figure thrown away casually. It was a video that was made on the subject of the genocide, Where Are My People? And the narrator said 3 million Armenians were victims of the genocide, 2 million assassinated, and 1 million deported. Well, when you're going from 600,000 to 3 million, what you're saying is nobody knows. And that's about all I can say. Nobody knows how many people were killed. We don't know how many were there, and the survivors survived in different countries where no adequate census was taken. They moved from place to place. There's no way of telling. And Armenians have had it rather easy that way. They've thrown these figures around for decades, and only now are they being challenged. And the challenges are valid in this case. The Turks and their supporters say that there were never more than 900,000 Armenians in the affected area, of whom at least 2/3 survived. The result, the number of Armenians who perished could be no more than 300,000, and an equal number of Muslims died at the same time from the same causes: famine, disease, exposure, wartime dislocations, and mutual slaughter. Yes, there was civil strife, there was civil war in Anatolia, but a government-sponsored genocide, that is denied. Phase 5 of denial is rationalization. Straightforward denial hasn't worked. It was necessary for the Turks to face the fact that something terrible did occur in Anatolia during World War I. But it was not what it appeared. Of course it happened, but gee whiz, it was wartime. War is hell. Let's look at both sides of the story, and here I'm quoting. Let's avoid prejudice, stereotyping, and scapegoating that are holdovers from the wartime propaganda of World War I. And also, they criticize what they call the machinations of Armenian activists who seek only to enrich themselves by passing the Armenians off as victims, or hope to advance themselves by jumping on the bandwagon that has made brilliant careers for Jewish academics and others who have helped make the Holocaust a richly rewarding industry. That's their terminology. There was no genocide, they say, no intention of killing the Armenians, and certainly no premeditation. It was all due to the horrors and dislocation of foreign invasion and civil war. And it was the fault of the Armenians. Occasionally the Kurds get blamed, since the Kurds are the bad guys in modern Turkey. The revisionists are willing to blame the Kurds. Phase 6 is relativism. Rationalization and relativism are not identical, but they are close enough that rationalizers of the Armenian genocide are usually practitioners of relativism as well. Yes, the events in Anatolia in World War I were horrible, but alas, these things have always happened. 1915 was a bad year all over. Look at the Western Front in France. Look at the U.S. treatment of American Indians, they say. Look at the Japanese rape of Nanking. Look at the German treatment of Jews, Gypsies, Poles, and Ukrainians. Look at the American bombing of Hamburg, Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Look at the American incarceration of Japanese and Japanese Americans in 1942. Look at all the lynchings of Negroes. And since World War II, look at what's happened in Cambodia, Uganda, Darfur, and other places. Well, my attitude, of course, is that these things did take place, and they still do, but it doesn't make them right. So you can't excuse the Armenian genocide on the grounds that these things have happened elsewhere. Meanwhile, Germany has done what it can to recompense the Jews, insofar as you can, for that many people killed. The United States has tried, more or less, to make it up to black people and to the American Indians and to the Japanese Americans. Turkey continues to deny everything. Nothing happened. that Turkey was responsible for. The last stage, phase 6, is institutionalization. In 1965, an organization was formed in Washington, the Armenian Assembly. I was invited to participate in the deliberations. I declined to do so. This was an umbrella group that was formed to act as a representative in Washington of the Armenian community in this country. This was then paralleled by the founding, a few years later, of the Assembly of Turkish American Institutions, paralleling the Armenian Assembly. Both of them are lobbying organizations. Both of them are headquartered in Washington, D.C., and both of them are devoted to advancing the interests of their particular groups. The Armenian Assembly, of course, has much more clout, since there are far more Armenians than Turks in this country. Also founded has been the Zorian Institute for Contemporary Armenian Research and Documentation on the Genocide, Diaspora, and Armenia. This was founded in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1982. A branch was founded in Toronto in 1984. And I believe that there's a branch in Los Angeles. I wasn't able to check on that. Together, they've published close to 20 titles on the genocide from the Armenian perspective. As part of this institutionalization, we may mention the Institute for Turkish Studies, which I've already spoken about, founded in 1993 with a grant of $10 million from the Turkish government. And of course, the various chairs of Armenian and Turkish studies established in this country since 1958. So where do we stand today? Denial and other techniques have been getting the Turks nowhere, and they're under serious pressure from the European Union. While the genocide deniers have become increasingly sophisticated in their attempts to erase the historical memory of the catastrophe, genocide defenders and Armenian activists dealing with the Armenian genocide have become equally skillful in responding. And they have been following unashamedly in the footsteps of Jewish activists, copying their more successful policies step by step. Just as there are now many institutes, departments, programs, and courses in Holocaust studies, in recent years there have emerged institutes, departments, programs, and courses in the Armenian genocide. Just as Jewish lobbyists have pressured legislators to include Holocaust studies in our high schools, so in northern New Jersey and California, the teaching of the Armenian genocide has been mandated or in preparation. Publishers have been busy putting together suitable textbooks for use in the local public schools in such courses. Not surprisingly, sponsors of recent chairs of Armenian studies have stipulated that the chairs are of modern Armenian history, not of ancient or medieval Armenian history or Armenian history in general. When I was invited to teach at CSU Fresno, as a Kazadian visiting professor, I was required to teach but one course, but the terms of the grant that set up this program required the course to be in modern Armenian history. And I was to give 3 public lectures on the same subject. So you see that the people who set up these chairs now are more interested in a modern period than in anything else. It's the genocide they're really interested in. And some of the more recent programs set up in Armenian studies not only specify modern Armenian history, they specify the genocide. Another ongoing movement among Armenian activists has been the push to achieve a recognition on the national level of the events of 1915 as a genocide, a goal that has been already achieved in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Poland, and other countries. Indeed, it is now illegal in France and Switzerland to assert that the Armenian genocide did not take place. These anti-denial laws I personally find particularly troubling. I've already mentioned the Bernard Lewis affair when he was brought to trial for denying the Armenian genocide. I personally do not feel that the way to fight these denials is through suppression. If they're going to say that the genocide didn't take place, I think we have to combat them with proof that it did take place, not forbid them to discuss the subject. A free country does not forbid the discussion of anything. The saga of genocide denial is not a matter of mere historical interest. It is still in progress. It is still going on, and absent Stanford Shaw, to a great extent, it's going on with the same personnel. There's a new face, however. Gunter Levy, a retired professor from Amherst, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, a very fine scholar. And he's written a new book published just last summer on the Armenian genocide, which he refers to as the disputed genocide. It's the most sophisticated attack on the idea of a genocide to appear to date. It is beautifully written and well researched. Levy gives the Armenians everything that they have argued for over the past 40 to 90 years. Yes, the catastrophe happened. Oh, it was terrible. Massacre of men, rape of women, kidnapping of children, plunder of valuables, looting and destruction of churches. He admits everything that the Armenians have ever claimed, except for one thing. The Ottoman government was not responsible. There was no government direction in these catastrophes and no premeditation. The catch here is that if the Ottoman government was not responsible, then the present government of the Turkish Republic cannot be held responsible either. In other words, reparations are not appropriate. This book has been attacked by Vahakan Dadrian, and I'll just read one brief passage from his review of the book. This is Dadrian speaking. For me, Turkey's genocide of the Armenians excludes them from the European Union, not because their forefathers did it, but rather because no one in, or particularly no leader of Turkey, has ever admitted it. They have never apologized, never made reparations, never made amends, never admitted any wrongdoing whatsoever. To the contrary, they have even passed laws that make it illegal to discuss it. But the old-time deniers are still in the fray. Their latest salvo comes from an unexpected source, Justin McCarthy. His new book, The Armenian Rebellion at Van, just published by the University of Utah Press, appeared last month. Hitherto a holder of the position, well, certainly we all want to get to the bottom of this. He is now, with the collaboration of 3 Turkish authors, come up with a description of the defense of Van in 1915, supposedly based on research in the Ottoman archives. He cites the affair at Van as a rebellion against legitimate Ottoman authority in the face of an imminent Russian invasion, welcomed by the local Armenians. Well, I know a great deal about the events at Van. According to McCarthy, the Armenians were planning a rebellion, and with the approach of the Russian army, they launched one. There's no mention in McCarthy's book about the massacres that had already begun in the villages around Van, which I know of from eyewitnesses. This is by no means a new interpretation of what occurred in the spring of 1915. It is in fact quite an old interpretation on the part of the Turks. Visiting Van in 1998 and again in 1999, I saw in the local Museum of the History of Van a display depicting the Armenian atrocities against the Muslim population that took place during the Armenian Rebellion. The signs on the exhibits were in Turkish, but conveniently an English translation was added. This is not the place for refutation of these various arguments put forth by deniers. Suffice it to say that at least 3 Turkish scholars, all currently employed at American universities, accept the genocide for what it was without qualification, and who even recognize the need for reparations. The most important of these individuals is Taner Akcem, a prolific author who teaches at the University of Minnesota. One good thing has come out of this genocide denial. It has forced Western scholars and Armenian scholars to gather their forces, dig into the archives, reevaluate the sources, and fine-tune their methodology and arguments. They've even drawn me into the subject. I'm not a specialist in the modern era, but I've become much more interested in the genocide since the emergence of the denial. I'm going to conclude here with 6 questions which I would pose to anyone who denies the existence of the Armenian genocide. First, if it was not pre-planned, premeditated, how did it begin so quickly after the outbreak of the war and proceed with such efficiency? World War II broke out in 1939. It wasn't until 1942 that the government decided to exterminate the Jews, and the mechanism to do this was not in place until a year later. Whereas the Ottoman genocide of the Armenians began 6 months after the outbreak of the First World War and proceeded very, very efficiently. Second, if the deportation of the Armenians was intended to protect the Ottoman defense against Russian invasion, why were the Armenians deported from the far west of Anatolia, from this part, Bursa, Ankara, that area there, far, far, hundreds of miles from the front, the Armenians were deported? Why, if the sole purpose of deporting them was to get them away from the Russian invaders? 3, if the deportations were not designed to harm the Armenians, why were they not deported to Western Anatolia, where sustenance could be found? Why were they sent to the barren Syrian desert, there to die of starvation? 4, if the deportation of the Armenians was only a wartime measure, why were the survivors not allowed to return to their homes once the war was over? 5, if there was no attempt to eliminate the Christian population, why were Armenians still being deported as late as 1923 and again as late as 1930? Why were the Greeks deported in the Great Population Exchange of 1922? Finally, if the government of the modern Turkish Republic is so benign in its intent towards its minorities, why were brutal and confiscatory taxes imposed upon Greek, Armenian, and Jewish businesses during the Second World War? And what was the cause and who was responsible for the riots aimed at Greek businesses in Istanbul in 1955? It is the silence of the deniers of the Armenian genocide in the face of these questions that give them away. They have no answers for them, and in their denial of the genocide, they ignore them. The short-range goal, of course, is their own particular interests. But the long-range result of genocide denial is that you lay the basis for future genocides. Do you want to get rid of your inconvenient minorities? You simply murder them. And then afterwards, you just deny that you did. In the words of Adolf Hitler, already quoted to you, who now speaks of the Armenians? Thank you.
Questions?
Well, I have a very short clip I would like to show you to illustrate what I've been talking about. We've been talking about the quality of sources. I'm going to show you a film where they talk about what happened at Harpert, and they focus in on the sources. And I think you'll see the quality of the sources that we have. It's very hard to deny them when you see them face to face. You want to put it on, please, Courtney? It begins with the daughter of a missionary recalling the events of her childhood.
And we was out underneath the mulberry trees. We used to eat the mulberries as fast as we could pick them. We had a good time under the trees. My mother wrote down things. She didn't write them every day. She just wrote them as they happened once in a while. But she did record a lot of what happened and what she saw and experienced, and put them in her diary, along with a lot of the material that she wanted to remember about us children while we were little.
My parents knew the Atkinsons. They were our neighbors. And until I found her journal, none of us knew that Casey Atkinson was keeping a secret record, one which could have exposed her to the Turkish authorities.
The first entry by Mrs. Atkinson about the Armenian genocide was on May 2nd, 1915.
May 2nd, several professors put in prison.
The Atkinsons observed the tragedy that was unfolding from the vantage point of the house they had built. Mrs. Atkinson had personally designed the building and had done a great deal of the carpentry herself. She would often sit by the window to sort out what was happening in the street below. Marie Jacobson, the Danish missionary, was also keeping a diary. On May 1st, a day before Mrs. Atkinson's entry, Marie Jacobson, writing in Danish, recorded the same events in her journal.
Der var meget uro i Harput. Flere butikker og private huse blev undersøgt og lukket. There was a lot of disturbance in Harput. 3 of our professors and the teacher were fetched or picked up by soldiers and brought to the government building. A little later they were brought to their houses again, where they were while their houses were being searched. Any piece of paper with something written on was taken. All the men were put in jail. Everyone is scared and expects a massacre. May 4th. People are in great fear. Everyone says it's all being done according to a plan, and it's a certain beginning of a massacre.
The German missionary Johannes Iman, the director of the Armenian orphanage, could see the danger to Armenians.
On May 5th, Johannes Iman addressed the situation in Harput in a letter to the German ambassador in Constantinople, Freiherr Hans von Wangenheim. He wrote, "For a few days, strict house searches are conducted in the Christian houses in the town and its surroundings. People who appear suspicious to the government are arrested, and the people are ordered to give up their arms."
Before our men were destroyed in the prisons, the Turks sent out messages that if the wives of these men would turn in all the guns, they would release their husbands from the prisons. And Reverend Amerikanian spoke from the pulpit one day saying that if the women would turn in their guns, that the Turks would release their husbands. Whereupon Mr. Henry Reeks, the missionary, who was head of the colleges there, got up and said, "If I were you, even if you don't have guns, buy them and turn them in." So many of the women bought guns and turned them to the government. Immediately, a message went to Constantinople saying that they had confiscated 1,000 guns from the Armenians who were rising against them. Consequently, they kept pushing that around, that we were rising against the Turks, which we were not. Those guns were turned in, were bought and turned in to have the husbands released. Instead of releasing the husbands, they murdered them and butchered them during the night and buried them in a big grave outside of the city. And
did you hear under fighting yourself?
yes. And then, of course, the men were all butchered, and then they began to take the women down the hill and kill them, butchered them also.
In June 1915, there was unusual military activity in the civilian areas of Harpert. The American consulate in Harpert realized that the Turkish government was falsely accusing the Armenians of hiding arms. Consul Davis, one of the key eyewitnesses, alerted Washington about the peril that the Armenians faced. Caleb Davis later found his father's original documents. He saw that they authenticated the testimonies given by the other witnesses. Some of Davis's reports were censored by the Turkish government and never reached the United States.
I think it's probable that in many cases the bombs, which were found in the backyards of the persons accused, were actually buried there by the police, so as to manufacture evidence against the Armenians. It is certain, however, that many of the people who surrendered some kind of a weapon were never engaged in any revolutionary plot, and that there was not even so much as evidence against many of them who were tortured.
Now began tortures to make them confess to having bombs. Before this time, all Armenians had been told to give up their arms, and many had done so. Now they began to torture to make them tell where their arms are hidden.
On June 18, Johannes Ehmann sent an urgent telegram to the German embassy. The Christians have given up their arms, and makes it clear that any allegation that the local Armenians would be in rebellion against the government are completely unbased.
Professor Reparations was taken in with all the intelligentsia to the prisons, and he was not tortured, but he was made to sit on a stool there and watch as they tortured the other professors and teachers and doctors, while they did some horrible, very horrible things to them, like putting a red hot metal pan on top of one professor's head, and pulled his nails out with pliers. They put their hands and feet in vice and pull their nails and toenails out. And they would hang them upside down in the toilet, which was an outhouse, until their head touched the floor. And then they would slice the bottoms of their feet and put salt on them. And they would torture and torture all the professors. With one professor, Tanikejan, who was the head of the Armenian group in the outfit, they pulled his eyes out and sent it to his family. And Reparations lost his mind. They released him and sent him to his home. And his home was just half a block from where we lived. We could watch him. He would run out of the house in the nude and he would scream, "Oh God, they did it again. Oh God, help them, they did it again. Help, help, help." He'd scream. And then his family would run out with sheets and bedspreads after him and cover him up and take him in his. This took place for about a month until finally he died.
lifetime of treachery and deceit. Armenians had endured persecution and massacres before. Now, something more sinister was going on. Parents kept their children at home. Families were governed by fear. Living not far away from the Atkinsons were the Hagopians, Dr. Mikhail and his wife. During the night of June 22nd, Ahavni Hagopian was startled by frantic pounding on the door. Her infant son started to cry in his cradle. In his study, Dr. Mikhail was entering notations in his journal. This night, he feared the Turkish police had come to arrest and imprison him under the cover of darkness. In fact, Dr. Mikhail had been summoned to the governor's home to perform emergency surgery on a Turkish chieftain. Mrs. Hagopian feared for her husband's life. Her eyes were on the street below, and she saw many of her husband's friends who had been tortured in prison. They were being carried away in garbage carts. She was certain he was among them.
They took a large group that had been in prison for several days. They took them at night in garbage carts. Through the window, I saw them by the light of the moon. They made the able-bodied walk and put the old ones in the garbage carts.
The Armenians deported this night became known as the Group of 800, the first of many groups forced on a death march.
I think that's all we have time for. I think I've made the point that I wanted to make.
The next morning, Mrs. Atkinson entered in her diary.
Let me say this, and then I'll take questions. There's only one truth. No matter what you're talking about, there's only one thing that is true. But there are many ways of lying. And what you have in the evidence that's come to us from all these different people from all over Anatolia always tallies. They always tell the same stories. Everything fits together. The only impression you can have is that these people are telling the truth. All right, I'll take questions. If anyone would like to ask me a question? Any questions? Ask the question. Embarrass me. Yes?
I'm very disturbed by our president's not allowing ambassadors to raise the question of genocide. They called back, was his name Evans? Mm-hmm. And they replaced him with someone else who will not ask the question.
The policy of the American government, the State Department, is not to rub Turkey the wrong way. I deplore that. I think a lot of people do. But the government, it's hard to find a good way of putting this, but the government is supposed to be looking after the interests of the United States, not the interests of the Armenians. That's the problem. And it's not in the interest of the United States to alienate Turkey. That's what it means.
It's been going on for years.
No, it has been going on for years, for a very long time. When there was an attempt made to film the novel about the genocide, the 40 Days of Musa Dagh, the Turks appealed to the State Department to stop it, and the State Department appealed to the Hollywood studio to just let it go, and they did. Another question? Yes?
You talked about the fact that Hitler was very much influenced by what happened in Armenia, with who remembers the Armenians. Have you, in your research, seen any influence of the Turkish denial on what we're seeing now in some of the patterns of Holocaust denial in places like Iran?
Well, I think they borrow from one another. There's no question about that. But as I said, the Holocaust deniers are a very shoddy lot. And the crowd that appeared I think in Iran, were more embarrassment to the denial than any real support for it. I mean, we really assorted gathering. I mean, some real anti-Semitic types were there. You know, that sort of thing. It was very, very unpleasant. Yes?
I was wondering, is Stanford Shaw the one who wrote a book about the experience of Jews in Turkey during the Holocaust?
Yeah, Stanford Shaw. I don't know if it was a book or an article, but you know, Stanford Shaw was Jewish himself. So the stand he took was, look how well the Jews were taken care of in Turkey. Well, there was no persecution of the Jews in Turkey. That is true. That is true. Yes, ma'am.
Given that the consequence of acknowledging would lead to reparations, I wonder, I know you're a historian, but could you conjecture about the likelihood that it will be acknowledged by Turkey, except for the pressure from the EU?
I think that what the Turks have got to realize is what the British realized in India. It's costing too much to hang on to that territory. It isn't worth the cost. And the British let India go because it's no longer profitable. And I think one day the Turks might conceivably let Eastern Anatolia go because it's no longer, it's costing them too much to hang on to it. But they won't give it to the Armenians. If they give it to anybody, they'll give it to the Kurds. And as I said to somebody, we were having a conversation earlier, that if I were a Turk and I really wanted to put the Armenians on the hot plate, I would say, here, you take Turkish Armenia, and you take the Kurds, and you keep and control them. Because there's 12 to 15 million Kurds there, and what is there in Armenia today? 2 million people? Officially 3.5 million, but that doesn't count the people who've left. There's about 2 million people there. So, another question, please. Some of these bright students I've been told about. No students have questions. Yes, ma'am.
What has enabled, like, the Turkish deniers to succeed and, like, infiltrate, like, UCLA and big institutions where Holocaust deniers haven't succeeded? Like, why is that happening?
Well, they got their jobs before they were deniers, except for Heath Lowry. They got their jobs before they were deniers, and then they turned out to be deniers. Some of them, they just grew into it. I mean, that became their field, like Stanford Shaw for one, and McCarthy for another. They sort of grew into it. They were hired, they were professors, and that became their work. They moved into Holocaust, genocide denial. But Heath Lowry got his job at Princeton. He was selected by the Turks. They said, we would like Dr. Lowry to have this position. And Princeton, to its disgrace, said, okay. They gave him the job. Yes? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, put your hand up. Okay. Oh, there's a microphone, I thought. Anybody else, please? Nobody wants to embarrass me.
Well,
Yes.
if Shaw was there at the same time Hovanesian was at UCLA, how did that relationship work? I mean,
The Hovanesian told me that Shaw was a very nice person. He was never nasty to anybody. And when Richard went in to talk to him, he said, I've read your book and I'm shocked. And Shaw said, well, maybe I should have said this, and maybe I should have chosen different words. He didn't give you anything to fight with, He sort of, became like a cushion. If you take a sharp sword and you try to cut a cushion, you can't do it because the cushion gives. And that's the way Shaw was. He was always very courteous. He was a perfect gentleman, right? And, yes.
Were these books used as text for some of the...
Well, his 2-volume book he uses as a text for his course. He had a 2-semester course, and you read volume 1 for the first. Well, Richard Hovanesian's book is also a text in his course. I mean, it's easy to point out these things that they're doing, but it's done on both sides. It's done on both sides. I mean, when a professor writes a book, he usually hopes that the readers is a textbook.
Why was the professors targeted for arrested first?
Why?
Why were the professors in 1916?
Oh, they were the intellectuals of the community. They were Armenian professors at this college that the Americans had set up in Harvard. The professors were mostly Armenians. They represented the intellectual heads of the community, and the Turks wanted them out of the way. In Constantinople, where there was no deportation and no massacre in 1915, and the Armenian community was left in place, all the intellectuals, 250 of us, were gathered at the very, very beginning of the genocide and taken into Anatolia and murdered there. They were murdered. You see, when you're reading about Armenian poets and Armenian writers and journalists, the death date is frequently 1915. These are people arrested and taken out into the provinces and murdered. One man survived. He was the composer and musical arranger, a monk named Komidas. He survived because the Turk recognized him. He said, "You're the choral master." Komidas said, "I've seen your chorus perform in Constantinople," and he rescued him. But Komidas had already seen the massacre of the other intellectuals right before his eyes. He went insane. He died in a mental institution in 1935. He was a great loss. He was a brilliant man.
I actually have a question.
Sure.
What do we do with all of our Bernard Lewis? For those of us who have been collecting him, I haven't quite a section in my library. I'm mortified.
He's a brilliant scholar. I would not say anything about the scholarship of Bernard Lewis, but he took the attitude that well, I should have pointed this out, that it's come down to the nitty-gritty of it is, was there a genocide or was there not? I think Bernard Lewis will say, yes, all sorts of terrible things happened, but it was not a genocide. And there are certain people in Holocaust studies who want the Holocaust to be a unique incident for which there is no comparison. There are some people out there, I think most are not, certainly not here at Sonoma. But there are some people who feel that way. And Bernard Lewis is one, and I'm told that Gunter Levy is another. They want the uniqueness of the Holocaust to be unchallenged. Yes?
When we studied the Holocaust, we talked a lot about the bystanders and the rescuers, the righteous Gentiles. In this genocide, were there such? Were there people who played both of those roles?
My family survived because their next door neighbor was a Turkish justice of the peace. And some of my family was already in America, and my grandparents didn't know what to do, And their neighbor said, Turkish justice of the peace, if you can get out, get out. Because if there's a war, they're going to make a clean sweep of your people. He told my grandmother that in the summer of 1912. So much for it not being premeditated. A humble justice of the peace knew all about it 3 years before it began. There were righteous people. Every time you talk to an Armenian, I've made it a habit now, I'll say, how did your family survive? And it's one of three stories. We were warned by friendly Turks, we were hidden by friendly Kurds, or we were rescued by friendly Arabs in the desert. And when I was in Israel, at the time of the commemoration of the Armenian Genocide, which takes place at Hebrew University every year, I was asked to speak, being a visiting professor, and I spoke what I've just said. I said I was so impressed by the Garden of the Righteous at the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, Yad Vashem. I said, I would like to see the day when the Armenians might set up a memorial to the righteous Muslims who protected Armenians one way or another. I met in Armenia a woman deep in her 90s who was Armenian, and she had been rescued by the man who married her to his son. And she was still alive, she was in her 90s, and she told us that they took the girls, they raped them, they cut their throats, and threw them in the river. And this Kurd standing there took her by the arm and said, you stay with me, I will be your deliverer. And he rescued her. So he couldn't rescue them all, but he could take one for himself. And he married her to his son. Yes.
Long before the Holocaust, there were pogroms against Jews in Russia and Poland. The Holocaust was just the culmination of that. Was there something comparable in Armenia? In other words, were Armenians being singled out for pogroms?
As early as 1894.
So this may be a rationale for the government's lack of involvement, that this is just, groups of Armenian, Turkish Cossacks, if you will, who were ready to wage pogroms. Is that ever used as a rationale for...
I have not heard it used that way. I've heard it used, because what happened in the 1890s was government-sponsored also. And Gunter Levy denies that. He says that the evidence for the Sultans being behind it, he said, is weak. Well, that's not much of an argument. He said the evidence is weak. Well, how weak is it? I'd like to see the evidence, No, there's not much evidence that the Armenians were disliked by their Turkish neighbors. Not much evidence at all. But once you get the mob going, you're telling people, take what you want, help yourselves. You can do anything to these people. And that's what happened in Poland when this terrible story, I can't remember the name of the village, but you may know it. There was a village in Poland where the Germans came in to make sure it was secure. And the headman of the village said, is it all right if we kill the Jews? He's talking to the invader of his own country. Is it all right if we kill the Jews? And the commander said, be our guest. And what happened? One half of the village murdered the other half. 1,500 Polish Catholics murdered 1,500 Jews in this one village. Herded them into a barn, set them on fire.
Josie. I think that's the way it's pronounced.
Josie? I thought it was with a P. Okay, Josie. In any case, there was a whole article on it in the Atlantic Monthly a few years ago. It was a terrible case. And how do you explain this? How do you figure it out that they would do such a thing? And at the end of the article, the man who wrote the article said, when all the explanations are given, he said it boils down to they did it because they could. Because they could. They were authorized. Yes.
Is one of the reasons that the Turks are so successful in denying it is their lack of documentation compared to what kind of documentation came out of the Holocaust?
Oh no, there's plenty of documentation. They just deny its validity. There's plenty of documentation. Now they've cleaned out the Ottoman archives, but they did it in a sloppy way. And I mentioned Tamer Akcem, who is one of the Turkish supporters of the Armenians. He's been in the archives. He said they've cleaned out all the orders. If you're looking for an order for the massacre of the Armenians, you're not going to find it. But what he found were things that were left behind, like a provincial governor wrote back to Constantinople and said, hey, if we killed the Armenians, who's going to bake the bread? All the bakers in town are Armenians. You see, so you can see that an order had gone out to kill the Armenians. And there was a couple of governors who were removed from their positions because they were soft on the Armenians. Yes?
This idea of having historians from both sides kind of meet and reconcile what happened, do you see that as an academic, do you see that as constructive, or do you see that as bringing a victim to trial again kind of setting?
Well, there have been meetings held. I think one was organized at the University of Michigan where scholars got together and debated this. But I don't think any of the key people on the denial side were there. Stanford Shaw, McCarthy, Lowry, they tend to keep a low profile. I attended meetings of the Middle East Studies Association. It's a huge convention, annual. I attended one in 1963 where all of these people were there and they all made their presentation, but they have not been there since. I have not seen them at any meetings since. They said what they had to say and then they retreated, and now they do it through publications. Is your hand up now? Sorry. Okay. Any further questions? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your brilliant speech. 1 second, please. Everyone, please, 1 second. Kimberly has an announcement. Where are you, Kimberly? Please, quickly.
The white flyers that many of you received that I passed out with the attendance sheet, the Sociology Club is having a fundraiser tomorrow, the 18th. They're also having one next Wednesday, the 25th, and the following Wednesday, the 2nd. Anywhere between 11 a.m. and 10 p.m. If you go to El Torito and present the flyer, 25% of the bill will go towards Sociology Club, and the Sociology Club then uses that money to bring presenters or movies or activities or fun things for you guys. So if you didn't receive a flyer, just let me know. I can get you one. If you have one, don't think you can go. You can give it to someone. But I'll have more flyers next week. If you could go, that'd be great. Thanks.
I want you to be sure to remember that next week we're going to have our